once he gets the word from James Donovan, he sets up this back channel with Lisa Howard, William Atwood, and John Daniel, okay, negotiating with Castro to find a way to get a rapprochement between the two countries. And I don't have to tell you this. What happens is that Daniel is the last guy in the chain. He sends this long message to Castro, okay, about how I understand what Batista did to your country. I understand why you took up arms, okay, and I am totally in agreement that that was the right thing to do at that time. All I
Wow.
ask of you is that you don't become a strategic base for the Soviet Union to spread, Marxist communism into South America. All right. And so when he heard this speech, Castro was stupefied. He couldn't believe it. Oh my God, am I really this is the American president saying this to me? You know, so and
Yeah.
so and so he was just in jubilation about it. Okay. And then when him and Danielle go out in Havana, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, they bring a phone over to Castro at this lunch table, and and Castro's listening to it. His mouth falls, and he says, "This is bad news." He says it 3 times. Okay, he says Kennedy's been shot. All right, and then about 20 minutes later, they bring the phone out to him again, and he get that Kennedy's dead, and he tells Danielle right at that instant. He didn't even think about it. He says, everything is going to change. Everything will change from here on in,
Yeah.
And he was exactly right because that was the end of the back channel. And by the way,
Mhm.
this is what now 60 years and we still don't have relations with Cuba.
Yeah, I wondered
Yeah,
if that hotline is still there and if anybody's used it in a little
right.
while.
Yeah, and you're
Yeah.
exactly right. The relationship with Russia has gotten, progressively worse and worse and worse. I
Especially,
believe.
yeah, from where we were at that video we just saw,
Yes.
and that was from 1992. It was just after the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was this
Yeah.
cooperation between the superpowers for the first time in half a century.
Look, let me tell you a little
Look how
story
far
about
we've
this.
drifted,
Let me
you
tell you a
know?
little story about this, which you probably don't know. I didn't know it myself. Reagan really liked Gorbachev,
Mhm.
okay? And he was actually told by Thatcher that we can deal with this guy, okay? If you can imagine her saying that,
Hmm.
all right? And so Reagan was ready to deal. He calls in Nixon and Kissinger, of all the people to call in on this, all right? And Kissinger tells him, no, no, Gorbachev is an old line apparatchik. He's just disguised himself, okay, as something he's not. Then Nixon comes in and he said he's even worse. As Nixon's leaving, as he condemns Gorbachev, as Nixon's leaving, he tells the guys at the door, don't let him be in the same room with Gorbachev alone. He'll give away the store. Can
Hmm.
you imagine saying that about Ronald Reagan? Yeah.
I could imagine Nixon saying that about Ronald Reagan.
I mean, that's really an amazing, this shows you
Hmm.
how bad Nixon and Kissinger really were and how
Yeah.
different they were from Kennedy,
But
you
isn't it
know?
weird now, Jim, to hear, of all people, Henry Kissinger's kind of the voice of reason right now on the current situation with
That's how
Ukraine
bad things
and
have
Russia.
become. That's how
Yeah,
bad
it's
things have
crazy, isn't
become.
it?
See, the the
Old
the ne-
warmonger Henry.
the neocons by about 1975, they began migrating, out of the Republican Party into the Democratic Party.
There you
and
go.
and and
Yeah.
these Democrats now became, for all intents and purposes, they were also neocons,
Hmm.
you know. And by the way, I'm sure you know how this started. It started when Cheney and Rumsfeld thought that Kissinger was too liberal
Hmm.
because he wanted to pursue a détente with Moscow,
Right.
and they kind of created an insurrection under Ford Okay, because Ford was willing to go along with Kissinger as both national security advisor and Secretary of State. And those two did not want that to happen.
Mhm.
And so that's how Kissinger got marginalized in the Ford administration. And this is
Right.
how the neocon movement really began to pick up steam, you know.
Mhm.
Uh,
And let's not forget who was running the CIA in those years.
yeah, George Bush,
George
you know,
Bush.
yeah,
Mhm.
George H.W. Bush,
Yeah,
you know,
where was he on November 22nd,
and so this all
1963?
becomes, I've actually talked about this on more than one occasion. You know, this was the ultimate burial. The neocon strike was the ultimate burial of Kennedy's foreign policy. Never, ever to come to fruition ever again.
Right.
You know, it's something that we talk about on shows like this now, because you can't get it anywhere else, and so,
Sad but true.
yeah, so that's how bad, things have gotten. Okay, now can we talk about what we're going to talk about next?
Well,
JFK
yeah,
Revisited?
now I wanna talk we haven't even touched on your new film or your book
Yeah,
yet. That was such
yeah,
a great, well,
yeah,
gosh, we ran 2 hours, but I do wanna get to that. And we talked about what happened to Khrushchev and that he was
yes.
removed because he tried peace and his party didn't like that. And
Mhm.
we're also gonna talk about what happened to Kennedy because the same thing, I believe, happened to Kennedy. I believe he was taken out by his own deep state. And I think you share that belief. It's a pretty safe assumption.
You want to
So,
you want to show the American University speech?
as a matter of fact, yeah, Rick has that, I think, queued up on his end. And I think that's a
Mhm.
perfect prelude to where we go next.
Mhm.
We're into 1963. There's a test ban treaty that the
Right.
president has negotiated with Khrushchev. And he gives this speech at American University in Washington,
This is
D.C.
the peace speech, right?
Yeah, we call
Yes.
it the
Yep.
peace speech.
Yep.
And
And I
I'd like
picked it
to
up
run a
here,
little of that.
actually around the same place. I think that your book picks it up, Jim.
Okay.
So I'll play the clip from right there. You guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward.
I think those are wise words that we'd be wise to take to heart today.
Let me explain how this came about. As you showed earlier, Norman Cousins was essentially a tribune for JFK to talk to Khrushchev. All right. And there's actually films of Norman Cousins' daughters in Khrushchev's Dachau, okay, that I've seen. All right. And they came back with a message that Kennedy has to do something before I can do something over here. All right. And so, said, well, why don't you make a speech about disarmament? All right. And so Kennedy was all for it because that's what he wanted to do anyway. All right. And so Ted Sorensen, I think, was the major author of this speech, which is really, nothing ever since, no president has ever made something like this before. Okay. But if you want to hear something really ironic, is that Kennedy did this in the same 48-hour period that he made his civil rights speech. They were kind of back to back. Kennedy made the peace speech, then he made the civil rights speech within 48 hours of each other, which is really, really, really kind of remarkable. All right. Now, after this, of course, comes the nuclear test ban treaty, the partial nuclear test, which I believe is in August of 1963. And Kennedy really, really worked hard on that. He made it a priority, and he made sure to get Eisenhower on board with it so he could get the most of the Republican votes. And that passed by a huge margin in the Senate. I think there was something like 83 votes for it. Okay. And that was really a very incredible achievement to go ahead and be able to draw up something like that at that time, And this shows, I believe, that the triumvirate was the Pope, Khrushchev, Kennedy, with Norman Cousins as their kind of messenger, okay, that was taking place at this time. All right. And they all agreed that disarmament after the Cuban Missile Crisis was a very, very good way to go. Okay. The remarkable thing about this speech is that if you listen to the whole thing, he makes reference to the Russians bearing the brunt of the German army during World War II and how they blasted out an area that was about the width of the city of Chicago to the Atlantic Ocean in the Soviet Union. And it was all true, of course. That is what happened. For an American president to say something like that, and because you have to remember back then, because of movies like The Longest Day and things like that, everybody thought that the United States won World War II in Europe, which is not really true. Okay, because Hitler had, I think, over 80% of his divisions were on the Eastern Front. It was really the Russians that broke the back of the German army during that war, So this was a very, very interesting and, I believe, remarkable speech, to have made for this time in history. And remember, it was this speech plus, I believe, 3 months later, Kennedy is going to sign NSAM 263, which was the order to bring home the first 1,000 troops from Vietnam as part of a long-term project that would extend into 1965 to bring, excuse me, I said troops, that's wrong. There were no troops in Vietnam at that time. Those were all advisors. Okay, Kennedy would not send combat troops into Vietnam. Okay, and so this was going to be completed by 1965. Kennedy had arranged it around the 1964 election. All right, that gets reversed within days of Johnson taking the White House, of course, as we know. And one of the things we did, we played in the film, I think it's in both versions, both JFK Revisited and JFK Destiny Betrayed, the tape of Johnson with McNamara, which I believe in February of 1964, where he very clearly is trying to get McNamara to switch positions on the war. And he says words to the effect, you know, I had to sit here and listen to you and the president talk about withdrawing from a war that the United States was losing. You know, how the heck do you think you can do something like that? You know, I thought it was bad in every way, especially psychologically. Okay. You know, and this began the campaign to turn McNamara. He actually asked McNamara to come out in public and denounce NSAM 263. He actually wanted to reverse NSAM 263. And then later on, what happens is the people left over in the administration from Kennedy, they begin to talk about Johnson is going to go ahead and escalate this war and blame it on JFK as a continuance of his policy when he knows it's not true. When he knows he's actually reversing Kennedy's policy, which of course is what happened. All right. When you get the whole thing about the phony Gulf of Tonkin, you know, the so-called episode in the Gulf of Tonkin, which really didn't happen anywhere near the way Johnson said it did. It was anything but an attack. It was really, and I think Bundy said this at the time, that it was really a provocation, you know, and that became the excuse to ram the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress.
Mm-hmm.
I think there were only 2 dissenting votes in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. There were only 2 dissenting votes, you know, and that was more or less the pretext. Now, just remember this, Rick, because I think this is so interesting. In November of 1964, the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission come out. In other words, the evidence is supposed to back the Warren Report, the 100-page Warren Report. 3 months later, in March of 65, Johnson sends the first combat troops into Vietnam. And nobody connected those 2 events. Nobody I know of in the media or any essayist or any academic ever connected those 2 events, which today, of course, it's kind of crucial. And in fact, some people, like me included, actually think that they are directly related.